Today we are going to be talking about Phantasy Strike. I want to give some of my first impressions of this game and what I think about it overall and why I think you should try it out. Phantasy Strike is a fighting game that does a lot of things right, from its presentation to its online experience, and there's some other things that I would really like to highlight. Before I get into the video, I just want to say that I do definitely recommend this game, and there's so many reasons for that. But if you're thinking whether or not you should try this game out, I would definitely say yes. Let's get into it. Right from the get-go, when you load into Phantasy Strike, you're greeted with a tutorial, a well-made one at that. Now, it can definitely be unfair to compare this tutorial to certain others in fighting games, because Phantasy Strike is built from the ground up to be simple and accessible. As such, you won't ever need to worry about 20 plus different tutorials to learn the base mechanics of the game, or combo command lists leaving you confused as to their meaning. There are a number of ways in which fighting game tutorials can be made effectively. Being able to communicate everything there is to know about the game to the player is obviously the most important thing. In my opinion, this should be executed in such a way that there's a lot of interactivity for the player and a lot of realistic interactivity for different situations, such as being on the other side of the screen. However, in my opinion, the tutorial should communicate all of this information but leave the player with a reason to jump into the game and learn things for themselves. Again, this is another area where I think Phantasy Strike gets a head start, which I'll touch on later. But when I finished the Phantasy Strike tutorial, I was thinking, wow, that was short but concise, so I want to jump into training mode and try and learn a character, as opposed to being burnt out on how long the tutorial took to complete. Whilst Killer Instinct 2013 and Mortal Kombat 11 have good tutorials in terms of the amount of information they're able to convey in relatively complex games, they take so long to play through and digest that I don't really feel like playing the game after I finish them. It could just be me and my low attention span, but I think that a tutorial should focus on being as short as possible and not feel too constrictive, and just give the player a bit more freedom. In those games that do put a focus on longer, more info heavy tutorials, I think the game should encourage the player to go and play the game for themselves for a period of time, and then encourage the player to return for the intermediate and advanced tutorials. That way the player can get a good amount of tutorial interactivity to learn the game and learn all its mechanics, as well as actual game time in between learning all that stuff. Anyway, I spoke a lot more about tutorials than I was originally anticipating. I just got so lost in my own thought about that. To switch the focus back to Phantasy Strike, I once again think that it has a very good tutorial. Yet again, the tutorial does have the advantage that the game is incredibly simple to pick up from the get-go, so there's no need for several tutorials outlining every little detail to do with offense, defense, the unique mechanics, and the situational stuff. So I want to quickly run through a bunch of things that I like about the Phantasy Strike tutorial and what it does right for introducing someone to this genre of game. Firstly, I love that the game uses a more universal language, using A, B and C to describe what buttons are being pressed. Most games prefer to use their own phrases and terms for this sort of thing. It sounds very simple, but this lettered system is great because it can be universally used to talk about fighting games and makes it easier, especially with the language barriers. Phantasy Strike is the first game that I've played that specifically outlines this language to the player. One thing that I picked up on whilst playing was that Phantasy Strike is almost designed as a tutorial itself, the entire game I'm talking about. That's not to belittle the game in any way, because I do have a lot of fun playing it, but the game's presentation, from its tutorial, its character guides and its overall gameplay, is very much focused around teaching people what fighting games are about, which I'll touch more on later. Another part of Phantasy Strike that I love is something that isn't directly about the gameplay, but it's that every character in the game has a comprehensive tutorial created by the developer. This is something that I wish that every game would try to do, not just in the fighting genre. Of course, the internet does exist, and with it, hundreds of guides and tips at the ready, but I think in these character-based games, developers should encourage players to watch these types of guide videos to get players off to a good start, so they know what they're looking for when they start learning to play a character. Off the top of my head, the game that did this the best was Evolve, where every character had a basic video simply outlining what their abilities are and what they do, as well as an advanced guide video which would go through some more situational stuff and different strategies. Of course, the more complex the game, the harder it is to make these, but I would still love to see more developers encourage this sort of practice. The training mode itself is pretty good as well. Not going to go into every detail here, but from the get-go you can see all of the necessary information for learning a character in depth. The training mode outlines all of the frame data in this concise manner, on screen and not too obstructive. Other games are generally more difficult to understand in this area. NetherRealm fighting games have a lot of information available to the player at the ready, but it's more hidden and harder to access. You're going to have to pause the game to see that, rather than seeing it straight away in a kind of live sense. Some games just don't bother to give you that information to begin with, however, like Samurai Shodown. Here in Phantasy Strike, you can see all the information you will need right where you'll need it, so you can start to learn characters in depth. As I said earlier, the game is very concise and beginner friendly as well. This game is designed in such a way that somebody who has never played a fighting game before can still learn how to play at a basic level and then start taking their gameplay to the next level. This would give them some universal info, useful for learning how to play other fighting games. A couple of basic things that spring to mind are the fact that this game has a jump button, it's not just a directional input. Additionally, there are no low attacks, so there's only one way to block. Now, I don't expect existing fighting games to change their tradition and design to accommodate new players to this extent. But it's interesting to see, because whenever I play Street Fighter with somebody new, I always have to explain how the blocking works in depth and how you can block low, high, and switching your block on cross-up attacks and things. And jumping with a direction rather than a button isn't always intuitive, especially for newer players. Simplifying the basics in this way ensures that the player can learn in depth what playing a fighting game is truly about. Mechanical barriers are a thing in fighting games, but they're only the first challenge to overcome in becoming a great player. Show some tournament level fighting game match to somebody who isn't really well versed in that and ask them what they think it takes to be this good. You're most likely to hear something about the execution of the players, how well they can perform these difficult combos, as well as the speed in which they play, their reactions. Whilst good reactions and execution are an absolute must for playing at a higher level, usually competitive fighting games employ a heavy mental element. This could be choices from the player, such as when to attack and what attack to use. If you make a mistake, the chances are you're going to get punished for it, and depending on the game, this can lead straight to death. There's also the element of getting into the head of your opponent. Knowing what they will do will allow you to counter it properly. And it's this back and forth mental and physical gameplay that gives these games their competitive depth. With single button inputs for all attacks, Phantasy Strike helps to alleviate that executional barrier for newcomers. As such, new players can jump into the game and quickly learn a character and the universal mechanics. And when said player wants to take their gameplay to the next level, they shouldn't ever have to worry about their combo execution, instead focusing on some of the other fundamentals such as movement, spacing, punishing your opponent, and matchup knowledge. Phantasy Strike isn't designed as a casual one-on-one fighter like Dive Kick, nor is it the next chapter in an already established franchise full of veterans such as Tekken. Phantasy Strike from the ground up is designed to accommodate that new player, but never feel like it's holding back the titans of the genre. Yes, Phantasy Strike tightens the skill gap between the average newcomer and the genre veteran, but it does not cater specifically to one audience or the other. Okay, maybe your average top tier fighting game player will not find this game very enjoyable, and maybe your average casual player won't think it's a great gateway into the genre. I don't think Phantasy Strike itself is a game changer, but it's definitely looking in the right direction. People always talk about the future of fighting games and how developers try to accommodate newcomers into an established franchise. In my opinion, Phantasy Strike is not what fighting games need to be to become better, but it is a great step, showing that it's possible to lower the skill ceiling whilst teaching the core fundamentals for being good at this type of game, especially to newer or more casual players. To touch on my first point again, should you try this game? Absolutely, there's really no reason not to. The base game is free to play, which is rare for a fighting game, and it's very simple to pick up and play. But that's all for today's video. I've heard only good things about the online experience with its netcode, but I haven't experienced that for myself, so I chose not to comment on it. Phantasy Strike appears to be a great step, showing developers that you can make something like this work. I can't wait to see how other developers try to tackle this challenge in the future. Thanks for watching until the end, guys, it really means a lot to me, and I will see you in the next video. Bye guys.